Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, November 25th, 2025, and our dear friend John Helmer is here with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima. Good to be back.
Please subscribe and hit like button, helping us reaching more people. And John, let me start with what was reported on CNN. Barack Ravid, the Axios journalist, was talking about the meeting. We had the 28-point document, peace plan
Yes.
on the part of the president of the United States. Then aftermath, there was a meeting in Geneva between, among the Secretary of State of the United States, Marco Rubio, together with Europeans and the Zelensky, the delegation, Ukrainian delegation. Here is what Barack Ravid reported about that meeting.
What happens then?
Well, I think that President Zelensky understood very well how high the stakes are. And that's why he did not rule out the Trump plan. He did not say no. And he said, I'm willing to negotiate based on this U.S. peace plan. And I think he's going to continue to do that. And I think what he's going to do, in my assessment, is going to be very similar to a sentence that a former Israeli Prime Minister Levi Eshkol said in the 1960s, when he said, I'm compromising and compromising and compromising until I get what I want. And I think this is what President Zelensky is trying to do right now. Just another word about the security guarantee. As far as I know, and I saw the initial draft security guarantee that the US gave Ukraine, I think this is the most significant security guarantee that President Trump agreed to give any country, especially Ukraine. And this was the baseline for the negotiations. Since then, the security guarantee got stronger. And it is modeled, it's not an Article 5 guarantee, that's for sure, but it is pretty close to an Article 5 guarantee, and this is significant.
John, before going to your comments, here is what Lavrov said about the plan.
Stand. The key proposals from the Trump plan are based on the understanding reached in Anchorage during the Russian-American summit that was held in August. And those principles are generally reflected in the plan, which we have welcomed, as President Putin said, because after Anchorage, there was a long pause. Now, this pause has ended with this document being proposed. We have not yet been handed this document officially, even though we had received it through informal channels. But of course, some language requires clarification, and we have not yet received the definitive version from the United States, or the version that is being speculated about by the media. And those who engage in this kind of megaphone diplomacy certainly have their own goals. There were some comments from Macron and from others that those are unacceptable terms, that it would be capitulation for Ukraine. But what matters is whether Ukraine is willing to engage in such an agreement. And until the final agreement is reached, the terms are confidential. And those who are trying to analyze the documents that were leaked deliberately to blow up the hype in the media. They're trying to undermine the efforts of Donald Trump. They're trying to skew the plan for their own agenda.
Go ahead, John. What's your take and what's going on?
Well, it's a very good question. I need to explain to our audience that I'm using a camera and a device while I'm traveling that doesn't allow me to look directly at a camera. look directly at the evidence, look directly at you and the audience. So pardon me for appearing to look rightwards when everything that's going on here is in fact leftwards. First things, we don't need an Israeli citing Israeli officials to advise us on what's happening. No Israeli has the competence or information base to tell us what's happening in this war first. So let's forget what Mr. Barak David said in Axios. Second, what's happening here is very different on the Russian side, on the Ukrainian side, the American side, from what's being printed. And what's not being printed, let's try to unpack. In the first place, we have a series of meetings in which the US is trying to conceal its retreat from an inevitable defeat in the Ukraine war. That's a Trump lose, lose, lose. As we've said before, Nima, Trump psychologically, the US politically and strategically thinks it must always win, win, win. This is a retreat. The terms of retreat are very heavily camouflaged here. All sides want to continue the war, leaving aside Russia, of course. What's at stake here are the terms of continuing a long war while camouflaging the pause to stop or provide a pause in the short war. So there's a difference between the sides on short war terms. On the other hand, what we have is a general agreement on the part of the United States government, the Trump administration, the NATO allies, all of them, and the Ukrainians, whoever's in charge in the Ukrainian General Staff and in Kiev politically, on the terms for continuing the war in Russia and somehow avoiding total military defeat, preserve enough of a short war pause, short of capitulation, total capitulation, and total end of a short war on Russian terms. So between short war pause and long war continuation, we have a lot of different attempts at reaching accommodation. All of that said, what do we really have here? What we have is the elimination of General Kellogg as the intermediary between a European and Ukrainian combination, plus their US supporters in carrying their terms to Russia. We have the replacements of interest, important interest. Army Secretary Driscoll, a chum, classmate at Yale of Vice President Vance, plus General Randy George, the Army Chief of Staff, plus General Donahue, General commanding US Army in Europe and Asia, plus 2 or 3 other generals. I'm just looking at my papers to see if I can catch the names. They appeared in Geneva. You can see General George in the background. I'm not sure that I recognize General Donahue at the table. You also have, and it's important to notice, Jared Kushner. Kushner represents the money interests of the Trump family. That's important. For the first time, you have two money men, Stephen Witkoff and Jared Kushner, representing points 13 and 14 of the so-called, what are we calling it, 28-point plan that the Trump administration produced. Those are the terms under which Russia would give up the notion that it had lost, had stolen, had confiscated $300 billion euros worth of sovereign reserves, allowing $100 billion to be invested under Kushner, Witkoff, U.S. administrative and directorial control in purported investments in the Ukraine, with 50% of the profitability going into the US side, meaning Kushner, Witkoff, and the Trump family. This is a very important transformation of Russian sovereign reserves into Trump personal profit making. That's rather unique. We also had, having to speak without the notes of point 14 in front of me, the redirection of the balance of the sovereign reserves, announced until now as a theft of Russian reserves and assets into a fund for joint US-Russian investment, essentially under US and Russian individual control. It's the privatization of the sovereign funds of Russia. That's a unique form of privatization. You could also call it Yeltsin-era stealing. It's a unique combination as part of a war, of a pause of a short war settlement. And there was Kushner and Vitkov at the table negotiating it the other day. Now, what we've had is over the last few hours in Geneva and then in Abu Dhabi, attempts made to change those terms. What we understand, and all of us are in a position, the same position. You can read the New York Times version, you can read the CBS version, you can read Fox News versions. They all come from briefings given by Driscoll himself or his spokesman and others in the US delegation who do not identify the Russian delegation in Abu Dhabi. That's significant because, as we'll come to in a minute, it appears that the Russian delegation in Abu Dhabi did not include any significant figure from the Russian Foreign Ministry known to Foreign Minister Lavrov. What that suggests is the counterpart Russians who were met in Abu Dhabi included Kirill Dmitriev, possibly Vladimir Medinsky from the Kremlin. This is a very significant shift in the way in which the Russian side appear to be dealing with Kushner, Vitkov, Rubio, and others. We are informed by the press that on the Ukrainian side, there was Yermak, Umerov, possibly Budanov. We know of no military figure on the Russian side sitting opposites in one room or another, across one table or another, of a comparable Russian military figure. So what we appear to have is a bunch of money men on the American side, a bunch of money men on the Moscow side, and no military, no one representing the Russian army that fought and achieved what they've done to date. That's unique, and I need to emphasize it to everybody. No military representation, no diplomatic representation. What has come out of this is apparently an agreement that there will be no border set in the agreement, no lines defined. That's incredible. No military representation on the Russian side to negotiate the way in which the lines would be drawn along the lines of contact. No lawyer representing the Russian side to reflect the Russian terms under which from the beginning of the special military operation to define what is Russian territory which has been won. The 4 Novorossiyan regions that have been incorporated constitutionally and legally in the Russian Federation, plus Crimea. No one is representing the Russian side yet to negotiate that in Abu Dhabi. And therefore, what is being discussed in Abu Dhabi is something quite different. We have been told, and I'm looking at my notes, there is no longer a limit on the Ukrainian army. As many of our audience knows, Nima, you've had colleagues who've made a point of indicating that in the original Istanbul 1 agreement, the Russian side proposed 85,000 men cap on the Ukrainian military. That was April 2022. The Ukrainian side, backed by the US, I believe, saw 250,000 men cap. I may be wrong, a few thousand. And suddenly, after 3 years of total destruction of the Ukrainian army, the number shot up from 85,000 or 220 odd thousand in 2022. Before, at the beginning of the special military operation, the number shot up to 600,000. Over the weekend in Geneva, it shot up to 800,000. And now in Abu Dhabi, we're told that all limits on the Ukrainian military that would survive the armistice, let's say, the end, the pause of the short war, all limits on the Ukrainian army would be removed. In other words, the pause that would refresh the Ukrainian army following its massive defeat by the Russian army. Now, nobody can recall terms of armistice in which a victorious army accepts a pause for such a ceasefire with refreshment as this represents. In addition, I'm looking again at my notes. We're told in all the sources leaking out of Abu Dhabi that there's the amnesty issues is no longer in the quotes 19-point or foreshortened agreement, the Abu Dhabi agreement, let's call it, Geneva modified to Abu Dhabi. There is let me see, no agreement on boundaries we've mentioned, no agreement banning NATO forces inside Ukraine. There are probably many other measures, but what are we looking at here? It's hard to believe there was any Russian delegation, even Mr. Dmitriev, and certainly Mr. Medinsky are hardly likely to agree on the fundamental abandonment of the principal requirements of the special military operation. No ban on NATO troops in the Ukraine means a reinforcement of the Ukrainian warfighting platform of Russia, which has been defeated and is in the process of total annihilation. First. Second, no limit on the Ukrainian army means that rebuilding of the Ukrainian army in the peace that would follow. It makes no sense militarily for a pause at this point, leading, as the Russian side expects, for a long war to continue, on which the Russian side has attempted for several years to find a solution to prevent the long war continuing. No agreement at all that would limit the ability of NATO to reinforce and rebuild everything the Russian army has won. Haven't I said enough? It is simply incredible that an Anglo-American press would report Russian agreement in Abu Dhabi to such a surrender of all the objectives already won and all of the objectives set out since the Foreign Ministry tabled the December 17, 2021 proposal for mutual assured security and non-aggression in Europe between Russia, the United States, and NATO. Who is surrendering here? Why don't I leave it as a question? It's a rhetorical question. Doesn't everyone listening understand the answer?
Yeah. John, here is what was reported on Global Times. They're talking about that 28 point after the meeting that Rubio had in Geneva. They have reduced to 19 points.
Yes.
And it seems that you've mentioned the three issues, the main critical issues was the limitation on the military size, the territorial concessions, and the NATO, membership. They were all removed from the 28 points, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
So what's left of, it's unbelievable. I don't know how do they believe that Russia would somehow make any sort of agreement with the West or with the Trump administration in such situation, with such conditions that they're putting on.
Well, if you go back to, to the picture, Nima, I can point out that in the picture, you can see at the very back on the left side, on the American side of the table, you can see at the very back of the table, the man in the military uniform, that is General George, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff. to the left of him, I believe you can see General Donahue, though because the military figure that I identify as Donahue may not be Donahue, but he is in a blue-colored uniform, not a regular U.S. Army uniform. Next to him is Rubio, and we can, on the other side of the table, we have the Ukrainians led by Andrei Yermak. The names are not significant. The answer to your question lies in the military officers on the US side of the table have come with Driscoll, who's on the left side of Rubio, on the left side of the picture, to tell the Ukrainian delegation on the other side, you cannot win this war. You have lost it unless you get out now. In a sense, the answer to your question is this group of people represent the losers of the war. The chaps in the military uniforms understand very well that there is nothing the US can do militarily now to stave off the defeat of all the Ukrainian pockets up and down the front, and nothing they can do to save Ukraine from the air attacks, slowly but surely eliminating power supplies and the capacity to fuel, heat, and light in the Western Ukraine for the remaining through the winter. Those are the uniforms who know. They are the uniforms who've told the civilians on the Ukrainian side there is nothing the US can do militarily to stave off such a defeat. So what were they talking about at the table? They were talking about the terms of a pause that would prevent such a total defeat. They were saying to Zelensky regime, you either sign terms that we will attempt to enforce on the Russians, or you will die. That's what that meeting represents. That's what the the combination of uniforms, Driscoll, Rubio, and the others were doing. They were disguising their defeat. They were protecting Trump from having to accept a loss in this war of a president who win, never lose, lose, lose. So to go back to your question, it becomes a question of what the Russian side proposes to do next. And that's a bit more complicated. And what we can see already, the foreign minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, insisted, as he did last week, as the spokesman for the foreign ministry said last week, as those of your colleagues who've been on the podcast already have said, they've said they have not seen the proposal. You can't negotiate with a megaphone. Dmitry Peskov said it for the president. Then the president called in the Security Council meeting last Friday night, the collective Politburo, you might say, of a decision-making body of the Russian side. And President Putin is recorded in the Kremlin communique as saying, we know what the proposals were. They were communicated through official channels. President Putin appears to have been contradicting the foreign ministry on the point. We know what they were. However, as Foreign Minister Lavrov has said in the clip you just mentioned, they appear to contradict the understandings we thought we had reached with Trump at Anchorage. Now, when Anchorage happened, that summit, we went through the details of a summit that was supposed to have lasted for 4.5 hours with a 45-minute press conference. In fact, we now know from the American side, not from the Russian side, that Trump got up and said, I'm going home after half of the time. He cut the entire proceeding short to about 2 hours, 15 minutes, and the press conference to 12 minutes. 12 of those minutes were occupied, 8 with a written statement that President Putin read out, and 4 that President Trump read out also. What does one learn or what does one understand when Foreign Minister Lavrov says were the understandings reached? Whatever we understand to have happened, half of the time occurred instead of the full amount of the time. So let's say half of the understandings they were aimed at were reached, not the full lot. So half of the understandings leave half, let's say, underinterpreted, ambiguous, difficult to understand in retrospect. So the Russian side is trying to say that while we don't yet know officially what the American side proposes, especially the so-called 28-point plan, points 13 and 14 in particular, that I've already mentioned, that deal with the investment of money, the Russian side, we say we can't officially negotiate with unofficial claims and papers that haven't been presented as a complete US package that the Ukrainians agree to. While we can't do that, there is a faction. There must be a faction. The evidence shows there is a Russian negotiating team in Abu Dhabi negotiating on the basis of those 28 points. Who that is, as I've said, speculative, and I've mentioned a name or two. What we can also infer is that there's not the kind of consensus on the Russian side yet on the details of the terms. And what we've also suggested is that there cannot be a Russian consensus yet, because the terms the US side is leaking defy the Russian consensus as has been enunciated by President Putin. So what Lavrov means by the Trump understandings, the understandings with Trump at Anchorage, is what President Putin told Trump that Trump appeared to understand and then agree with. What those understandings are contradicted by almost all of the terms. The Geneva terms, let's call them, instead of using arithmetical tags, 28 points, 19 points, and so forth. Let's bear in mind that there are 31 points in the original June 2025 Russian document at Istanbul. Let's talk about, tag them with the geographical names. What we can say is, and I hope this answers your question, there is a division of labor and arguably a division of view, and therefore dissensus, not consensus, on the Russian side of what the Americans are doing to organize an allied agreement. And if they go to the extent we have now been told happened in Abu Dhabi, we ask, who are the Russians who are there to suggest that they agree to this extension? And does the extension, with all of what we've just said, amount to a fundamental contradiction of the Russian terms with objectives of the special military operation, and a fundamental contradiction of what has happened on the ground?
Yeah. John, what we've learned just moments ago from Peskov, he said that Russia has not received any updated version of Washington's Ukraine plan, the new one that they are preparing. And how do you think that as time goes by, the situation, because Europeans have a crucial and important role, in my opinion, in the whole situation, and we've learned from the Russian sources, from the Russian, the intelligence, the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service. They're talking about the Britain has developed a plan in case it wants to undermine Trump's peacekeeping stance for its own benefit. What is going on in the mind of Europeans right now, and what is the crucial point that they're pushing for?
I believe you've asked me that good question before, and colleagues on Dialogue Works have slightly different views, but let me try to repeat what I believe the evidence shows. The evidence shows that the European regimes understand that they too cannot appear to lose this war. on the other hand, there's a limit of their resources to continue the war. The Europeans wish to continue, in particular Germany, the UK, and France, wish to continue the long war against Russia and have bet the future of their weak political regimes on the continuation of the war. Germany is remilitarizing, Poland is remilitarizing, France and England, the UK, doing the same, Finland and all the others up and down the northern European front. They must continue the war. They must avoid losing the war in any decisive way. They haven't the resources to do this, especially since the Trump administration has enforced the principle that whatever the Europeans do to continue the war, they must pay the United States' bill. So continuing the war for the United States is a case of first not losing, and second, extracting money from the Europeans to pay for the weapons required to continue the war on the Ukrainian warfighting platform. So not losing and continuing, those are, let's say, slightly contradictory objectives, but those are the objectives of the European powers, and we can see it in all of the terms. To cover the lack of resources, points 13 and 14 of the so-called plan mirror the European insistence that the 300 billion of sovereign reserves stolen from the Central Bank of Russia at the beginning of the war will be used to cover war-fighting costs and reparation costs, and you name it. The Ukrainians have a label for what they intend to do after they've stolen the sovereign reserves, and that covers some of the gap in Europe's and the US aim to continue the war. So that's what's happening. What else can we try to say? To what extent the European electors, the voters in Germany, will tolerate this kind of short war, long war continuation at the cost of the European taxpayers, at the cost of European electricity inflation, at the cost of all the social welfare that's been abandoned in favor of military objectives. It's up to the European voters to express themselves, but so far they've been repressed. They haven't. And until they do, this combination of contradictory objectives with remilitarization will continue. Now, the money also talks as loudly, if more loudly, than votes. And the money markets have, over the last few days, cut the stock market price of the defense companies, the listed defense companies of France, the UK, and Germany, and the United States. The market thinks that there's going to be less war, meaning less state procurement money, meaning less taxpayer money in the US and in Europe for the continuation of the war through state spending on the defense companies. Less state spending means less revenue, means less earnings, meaning less share price and capital gain, meaning less bonuses for everybody. The money markets are saying they don't believe that the terms of a peace would allow a long-term war form of prosperity for themselves. So money markets are talking more loudly at the moment than European voters. But the contradictory nature of European decision making remains. And this is not the coalition of the brain dead. This is not the coalition of stupid miscalculation. It's a clever calculation of politically weak individuals combined with the US fantasy that lose, lose, lose can be disguised as win, win, win.
John, who has prepared the 28 plan on the part of the United States? Do you believe that it was Steve Witkoff together with other people, or it was him together with Kirill Dmitriev? And what do we know about that? Because yesterday, John, the point that I'm trying to make, because yesterday I was talking with Paul Kirk Roberts, he said that 600,000 is too much for Russia to accept. You know, as you mentioned during the Istanbul talks in April 2022, they were talking about 85 or 65,000 soldiers on the part of Ukrainians. And right now,
yes,
increasing drastically to 600,000. And right now, Europeans have proposed 800,000. And as you've mentioned, it seems that in the new plan after Geneva meeting, it was removed, the limitation was removed. How do you see that?
Well, I'd be repeating myself and saying, and I agree with colleague Paul Craig Roberts, the number represents the number of the victor, not the number of the defeated. And Paul Craig Roberts is not the only one of our colleagues on Dialogue Works who've made clear that this sort of numerical limit is not an internal security police force, security force to ensure internal security, not war-making capability. All the revision of the numbers represents the continuation of war against Russia on the Ukrainian battlefield. And there is no justification for the Russian side to accept the original number beyond the original number offered by the Russian side, 85,000, if I'm not mistaken, in the April 2022 agreement. Not only with this is in the annex of the agreement, as our audience can see from the New York Times printout of the agreement as drafted. Not only 85,000, if I'm not mistaken, numerically, but special limits on the number of tanks, the special limits on the number of long-range artillery pieces, the special limits on long-range missile and rocket equipment to attack Russia. All of the limits on that annex were designed to ensure that the Ukrainian territory does not continue to be a war-fighting platform to attack Russia, not Russia in the Novorossiyan regions, nor Russia in the hinterland, nor Crimea. That's the meaning of the number. With that number of men comes all of the other limits. Any suggestion that an end-of-war settlement would have no limits whatever and no withdrawal of NATO forces, staffs, planners, intelligence sharing, missile teams, and so forth. Any abandonment of those limits means continuation of the war. Therefore, it's not a peace agreement at all. It's something that's essentially ceasefire in place, enabling reinforcement. And that's been explicitly rejected over and over by President Putin and everyone on the Russian side, including the Politburo, the Security Council. It's not part of the Anchorage understandings. And it was clear, let's just take that point, when Lavrov speaks of the preservation of the Anchorage understandings, which, by the way, two foreign deputy ministers, Galuzin and Ryabkov, had said the Anchorage understandings had been exhausted. And they said that more than 2 weeks ago. For them to be corrected means a revision of the public way of talking. So let's go back to what the understanding means, because the numbers you mentioned correctly, Nima, symbolize the understanding that what would be left after the peace agreement, not a ceasefire in place. We know there was that degree of understanding with Trump because Trump said so. He said, I'm not any longer insisting on ceasefire in place because such ceasefires don't hold unless you have a comprehensive peace agreement along with it. One of the only pieces of common sense, one of the only non-jingle complex sentences the President of the United States has been capable of in these last months that Trump said, only we know he reversed himself. How did he reverse himself? We talked about it on Dialogue Works. Dialogue Works has led with a clear understanding that Trump reversed that position, then threatened to deploy the Tomahawk. Everybody remembers that. And then threatened and then introduced the significant so-called Stone Age sanction, the sanction that would drive Russia back into the Stone Age of blocking all Russian oil sales to India, China, Turkey, and Europe. Now, if those were contradictory to the understandings Lavrov means that were reached in Anchorage, when Peskov reinforces that point, they're saying the same thing. So where are we? Isn't that what your question comes down to? Where are we now after the Dubai meeting? Answer: Russia hasn't received what Dubai meeting came to. We don't know yet, but highly suspect that if there was a Russian delegation in Abu Dhabi on Monday, it comprised at least Kirill Dmitriev and probably Vladimir Medinsky, but we have no way of confirming whether this is true or false. We might be breaking news, but there is no confirmation in the Russian press today yet. And even if there were, the Foreign Ministry's position is that the Security Council has not agreed to such terms. Where are we then? If the Russian side says we didn't agree to such terms because they contradict the Anchorage understandings, and they do, what does the Russian side say? The Russian side is saying, don't blame us for the continuation of the war, because these terms were invented as a smokescreen to camouflage continuation of the war, which is what the Europeans want, what Zelensky wants for his own survival, and what most of the US side want, by either for private, family, and personal profit. That's why Kushner and Vitkov were at the table, or for the continuation of the war without the losses that brought General George to the table, General Donahue to the table, and Army Secretary Driscoll to the table.
Yeah. John, I don't know if you follow this story of corruption in Ukraine. They were talking about Yermak being at the center of this corruption, and it seems that the establishment in the United States doesn't want to let him go down with that corruption, with this accusation on him. How do you see the situation with the Zelensky administration? Because that could play an important role to put them in a corner, somehow putting pressure on them to accept, the settlement, the points in the plan in terms of the limitation on the military, territorial concessions, all of this.
Well, we did discuss this the last time, and I have to repeat my disclaimer that, pardon me, to discuss corruption, one magnitude over another in Kiev, one has to have better sources than I have in Kiev, for longer than I have in Kiev, to explain the extent of the corruption in Kiev, the volumes of money, billions of dollars, not simply millions of dollars, as Timur Mindich was accused of having stolen. This involves all factions of the Ukrainian government since 2022, all of them. What I did between 2014 and roughly 2018 was to document the billion-dollar corruption that ensued with IMF monies, World Bank monies, European monies, Canadian monies, and US monies going into Ukraine through the National Bank of the Ukraine, and then being divided up between the Ukrainian bankers Kolomoisky and Privatbank, Viktor Pinchuk and his, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Credit Bank and others, through them and on to all of their enterprises out of the Ukraine into their private pockets. Those were multiples of billions of dollars. And that corruption isn't being rolled back. In that corruption, everyone, including former President Petro Poroshenko, the present so-called President Zelensky, his principal and deputy Andrei Yermak, and all the others are involved and engaged. To the US-led operation to soften Zelensky up for agreement, to soften him but not remove him, has involved millions of dollars of corruption in the energy sector of Ukraine through the individual whose name is Timur Mindich, and that we've been talking about before. What we have to say here is that there's a political succession fight that follows from the anti-corruption campaigns. There is also a military succession issue, struggle going on over whether General Syrski should be replaced as the loser of the current round of battles along the front. And if he's removed, what replaces him in the general staff? Is it a general staff designed to survive, to fight the new war after the so-called pause or short war terms are adopted? In other words, will the Azovists, the Banderists, the Beletskis, and there are many other names associated with the neo-Nazi formations in the Ukraine, get control of the general staff? That's the military succession problem, and in which Budanov, the head of GUR, the chief of the general staff's military intelligence unit, can play in one direction or another. So you have two succession problems in the Ukraine: a military succession problem, a political succession problem, both of them aimed at a method for holding power and keeping money after the armistice, let's call it, after the capitulation, after the ceasefire, after the settlement. Call it what you like. So there are two succession problems in the Ukraine: the anti-corruption campaigns, both the American one, the English one, or the British one, the European one, all aim to remove one lot from political or military a direction of the country to go on running the war forever against Russia until, in the Azov mentality, the neo-Nazi or Banderite mentality, Russians cease to exist. Theirs is a genocidal objective, and they will never give up. So what we have are multiple succession problems for the continuation of the long war, and a struggle to dictate the terms of the short war to advantage one party or another in the Ukrainian side. Factional politics are normal politics everywhere. Corruption campaigns have factional value in the Ukrainian political and military situation right now, and it's a level of fine detail we can't get into. We don't have the time now. The general point is, to repeat it, that this is a struggle for power to continue the long war against Russia. That's what it is.
John, I know that we are somehow pessimist about what's going on with the plan, but if we can go beyond that, a little bit optimistic point of view of what's going on, let's assume they can get something as a settlement in Ukraine. We had, China, Xi Jinping calling Donald Trump, supporting, any effort that could put an end to the conflict in Ukraine. Do you think that, considering what has happened during the Minsk II agreement, if something happens that could bring all sides together to reach an agreement, do they need any guarantors for the agreement, for the settlement?
The Russian side wanted guarantors in Istanbul. If I'm not mistaken, there was an argument. China would have been one of the guarantors proposed by Russia, accepted by the other side. I believe France and the UK were guarantors along with the US as proposed by the Ukrainian side. There was then an argument, if I'm not mistaken, in my recall of the April 2022 draft treaty, that Belarus was proposed as a guarantor on the Russian side, not accepted by the Ukrainian and American and British sides. Turkey was proposed by the NATO side, let's say, not accepted by the Russian side. These are, let's say, guarantor nations in a formula, as I recall, that had them supervise the implementation of all the provisions for ceasefire, the provision for withdrawal from fixed lines, the enforcement of fixed lines, the enforcement of demilitarized zones, and so forth. Now, as I understand it, I have to look at my papers, but this is very important for our audience to understand. You must look at the papers, the small print here, to understand the answer to your question. The security guarantees in the 28-point plan were essentially a US operation for which the US was promised financial compensation, and a formula that wasn't a bad one, technically speaking. Any breach of the provisions of the agreement would, under the security guarantee, trigger two things. One, the resumption, a snapback of sanctions against Russia as its punishment. Second, it would do away with the committee structure for deciding whether that was a violation, X was a violation or not a violation. It was a much simpler formula, therefore easier to adopt and easier to agree to. The US would play that role. And then there would be other measures that would benefit the victim of any violation. If the Ukrainians attacked Russia or the Russian side attacked Ukraine, the US, in a sense, would be a single umpire, not a committee of umpires. These were the formulas adopted between 2022 and last week. But let's remember, and it's important to remember, the small print and the large print of the December 17, 2021 agreement proposed by the Russian Foreign Ministry. You can't have any of this small stuff without a comprehensive reciprocal non-aggression treaty in which NATO rolls back, in which you have verifiable disarmament on both sides, in which you have a genuine commitment on the part of the Europeans and the Russian side to desist from any moves that would represent a threat to each other. Now, that doesn't mean an agreement on the Russian side for Poland to become the new base for nuclear-capable air forces, which is in the 28-point plan. Yeah, it's completely inconsistent, the new provision, with that framework. So what am I trying to say? Gather up all the small detail, read all the small print, and you have different schemes for security guarantees. What security guarantees mean is mutual confidence of an end of threat in Europe, doesn't it? The Russian side offered the US a treaty, dismissed summarily by the Biden administration, and we were on the inevitable downslope of the road to war, which broke out in February 2022. Without a comprehensive agreement on security guarantees issued back and forth of the 2021 treaty type, these committee of security guarantors or a formula for the US as a guarantor with snapback provisions, punishment provisions, violation provisions, none of that works to effect the comprehensive security. So in the answer to your question, security guarantees must be comprehensive. They must be reciprocal. They must be mutual. They must extend beyond the battlefield, not replace the Ukrainian battlefield with Poland, not replace Poland with Finland or the Baltic states, not replace all of those states heading north with Greenland or the Arctic corridor, not move the war in sequence form, as we've suggested before, from Europe to Asia against China, not rebuild the Ukrainian warfighting platform for the United States against Russia into the Pakistan warfighting platform against Iran, against Afghanistan, and Russia on the southern front, against Russian ally India. We don't have a serious commitment from the US side to the level of mutual and comprehensive security that Russia tabled back in 2021. All of this stuff, all of this fine print is smokescreen and camouflage. Why? Why? Because the Russian side has proved it can defeat any weapon, any offensive or defensive weapon. General George, General Donahue, the US Air Force, and the NATO allies have fielded in Ukraine. The Russian side has defeated them, will defeat them, can go on defeating them, and go on to destroy the other side, the adversary side, the Western side, on the Ukrainian battlefield. All of these things are attempts not to provide security guarantees, but to provide the basis for continuing the war. And they are therefore fake security guarantees.
John, it seems that in the mind of Russian officials, whatever happens in Ukraine, they're going to face somehow the NATO threat for a long time. And I don't know if you saw the Iranian ambassador to Russia talking about that Russia proposed some sort of defense pact between like-minded, countries to come together. Here is the map is circulating in the internet, and you see the members. They're talking about the members. The green part, the dark green, is the members of the new defense. Is Russia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Armenia. We have observers like Serbia, cooperation with Iran in blue, and we have former members in red in Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan. And how do you see the way that Russia would handle the case of Ukraine, the case of NATO? Because it doesn't seem that NATO is going to go away from, they're getting closer to Russia. With the case of Ukraine, it's getting complicated every time we talk about it. What is the permanent solution on the part of Russia? Is that a new Warsaw Pact that they can somehow confront NATO in a way without, getting involved in a war, but creating some sort of force to deter, NATO?
Well, you used the right word there, deter NATO. The map's miscolored. Armenia has moved, Azerbaijan has moved away from its relationship with Russia towards a relationship with the United States and NATO. This is clear, and we've discussed both the case of Azerbaijan in the past, in previous programs in Armenia, and we simply don't have time to go through all of that geography. That's a wishful thinking map. It's a very wishful thinking map. The existing map of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the existing map formed by the strategic defense agreements that Russia has with Iran, with DPRK, the North Korean Republic, with China, with India, with Venezuela. These form a different geography. But the key point you make is the valuable point. To what extent do these pacts and the military intelligence sharing and defense sharing implementation that follows the writing that's signed deter US attack? Well, I think we have reason to believe, and your dialogue works, provides folks not just with opinions. Opinions from people like us are a dime a dozen. What's valuable is the reading of the evidence. The reading of the evidence is that the Russian-Iranian defense activity, far more than what's on paper, have deterred another round of Israeli-US attack. Deterred. Why? Because the level of damage and defeat that can be wreaked on the aggressor, the Israeli and US in this case, were they to try again, would be much more costly than they've experienced before. So they don't proceed. That doesn't mean they stop their war. It means they reach for Pakistan to attack Iran from the east in the Iranian geography and so forth. I believe, and we've said it before, that Venezuela's relationship with Russia has produced a degree of deterrence, not only the Russian assistance, which is secret, but also the degree of mobilization of the Venezuelan people. The combination deters the US fleet in the Caribbean, the Marines and the other intervention forces, forcing not an end to war against Venezuela, but forcing Trump to abandon his fentanyl cover story, force him to pursue covert operating methods for regime change and so forth. The level of deterrence on the Russian partnership side has been rising. The level of withdrawal, of abandonment of overt battlefield intervention for regime, that's been deterred. And what we now face is a major experiment or test of the resilience of the Russian side in continuing to deter. And we see a difference of view on the Russian side about what can be achieved in the short term for economic benefit. Remember, we've said it before. We've said it on the Dances with Bears so that folks can look at the numbers. The Central Bank of Russia's governor, Elvira Nabiullina, protected by the president himself, is forecasting zero growth this year, zero GDP growth, and 2 years of recession, 26 and 27. 2 years of recession to come. For Russia to go into recession and attempt to fight this war, that combination is a destabilizing one, deeply destabilizing one for Russia. It encourages Russia's enemies. It encourages Russia's enemies to continue the war because they believe that President Putin, notwithstanding his high and stable popularity, can lose that in a 2-year recession. And then we head for Russia into the presidential election and succession race that must be completed by 2030. So 2 years of recession represent the opportunity that the central bank's programmed recession offers the allies, the Western allies, to again continue the war for the demolition of Russia. This is a very serious problem, and Russia must solve it domestically. But this is evidence, folks, and you must take it into account because the Europeans believe it gives them confidence. This is the internal map of Russia, and that combined with the partnerships you just mentioned raise an important question. Is Russia willing, under these uncertain circumstances for the next 2 years, to be able to be relied on by its strategic allies to deter, in their defense, their enemies, all led by the US and NATO? That's an important question, and it's an important question that the Dialogue Works is helping to answer little bit by little bit every week.
Yeah. John, the other crucial issue is the Russian assets in the hand of Europeans. They're talking about if, in the case of the continuation of the conflict in Ukraine, they want to use these assets. In case of reaching any sort of settlement, they're talking about reconstruction of Ukraine using these assets.
Yes.
But is there any case in history that was the same? Because did the United Kingdom pay for the reconstruction of Germany? Is Israel going to pay Palestine for reconstruction of Gaza? They're bringing something out, it's a war in Ukraine, a proxy war in Ukraine between the West and Russia.
Yes.
And how come Russia would pay for the reconstruction of Ukraine?
Well, you rightly make the point. It's unreasonable that the aggressor, Ukraine, having been defeated by the target of its attack, should then be rebuilt by the target of its attack. When President Roosevelt met the Saudi King Abdulaziz and suggested that Saudi Arabia either accept Palestinians for the emptying of Palestine so it could be populated entirely by Jewish people leaving Germany, driven out of Germany, surviving the Holocaust. Abdulaziz said to FDR, this is unique in history, Mr. President. Are you suggesting that the victims of German war, who've survived, should pay for the damage Germany did and help Germany recover at the expense of the victims? Abdulaziz threw that answer, the answer you've just given, in FDR's face when Saudi Arabia was much weaker than it is today. Well, we know what the US policy continued to be, and finally, the Trump policy is exactly what FDR proposed: the emptying of Palestine of all its Arab population and the remaking of the state as an entirely Jewish state, expanding into Syria, Lebanon, and so forth. Should the victims pay for the victory? Should the victor pay for the damage that was intended to be inflicted on them? These are moral questions, but strategically, Russia's already answered with the two strategic objectives: special military operation, the demilitarization of the Ukraine. That's not the use of Russian resources to rebuild Ukraine as a new, fresh war-fighting platform. That flatly contradicts and opposes it. The denazification requirement is at the minimum new elections, the end of mobilization, the end of emergency rule by Zelensky, elections within 100 days of the signing of the pact is a provision of the 28-point plan. That's there. That's positive. We accept it's a positive. Russia can accept that, but without denazification, the election provision there, it means the opposite of what Russia has proposed. Does that answer? We could go on and on. We can go through each of the 28 points. We could go through the 19 points. We could go through the Abu Dhabi shortening of those points. They all come down to the same fundamental conclusion that you yourself made, Nima. For Russia to accept this is a flat contradiction to the self-defense that was necessitated by NATO moving east. That's fundamental. But there's a necessity to reach a peace, to prevent the killing, the useless sacrifice by the Europeans and Americans of Ukrainian lives and Russian lives. That's a fundamental human principle too. The politics of the information war require that Russia should not be blamed for the preposterousness of the claims that speak of peace, but in fact a smokescreen of war. So we have a propaganda warfare dimension to this, and we're trying to reject propaganda warfare by giving our audience enough of the facts, enough of the small print, so that you at home can interpret for yourself, whether you agree with me, with Nima, or with our other colleagues, that what's being offered is a smokescreen to cover US and Allied retreat and defeat, and to enable them to continue this war, to sequence it on to the war against China, to find new ways of attacking Iran from the east, from Pakistan, new ways of attacking and weakening India, and so forth and so on, all the way to the shores of Venezuela. We hope that by looking at the detail and listening to our version of the evidence, and then going to the written versions, the Dances with Bears documentation, and others of our colleagues who produce the evidence, then you can decide for yourselves, are we exaggerating or are we reflecting? In a courtroom standard, who's guilty of the murder here? Who's guilty of the crime? Who intended the crime? Who used the weapon? Who fired the shots? Who produced the deaths that are criminal? In this case, I hope we've made clear that the Abu Dhabi and Geneva meetings were producing fake alibis to cover the crimes which the Russian army has defeated, and will go on defeating until the end, till the required end.
Yeah. Thank you so much, John. Great pleasure as always talking to you.
Thank you very much for having me, Nima. See you next week, when I think I'll be able to look more directly at the camera and find the documents more easily than we have today while I'm on travel. Thank you very much, Nima.
Thank you, John. See you.